Greetings Pathfinders, and welcome to the Absalom Archives. This is going to be a series of videos covering the lore and story of the Pathfinder and Starfinder universes used in the games of those names published by Paizo. It's my goal to cover every bit of lore, story, and world building that each game has to offer, and with that in mind, you're probably wondering why this is issue 0 instead of issue 1. There are a few reasons for that. Firstly, I have a pretty ambitious plan for a lot of series on this channel, and in order to keep them easily searched for and watched by a viewer, they're going to have their own numbering system. Because of that, I thought it would make more sense to have this be issue 0 so it can serve as an introduction to any one of the video series you might want to watch in the future. Secondly, this video is going to be a little different from one of the ones you'll see on the channel going forward. My focus is going to be the world of Golarion and the universe surrounding it. I won't be talking as much about the actual game of Pathfinder and its mechanics. While that could change in the future, I'm not really a theory crafter, build maker, or number cruncher. The rules are fun, I like learning them, but I don't have a lot to talk about on that end that I feel hasn't already been discussed by better channels. As such, I want to mention the actual mechanics of things as little as possible. Now, in certain cases, that may be difficult to completely avoid. One of the topics I want to cover is the various monsters, and oftentimes giving information about those is going to mean touching on or outright talking about their special abilities. To use a well-known example, if I wanted to make a video about trolls and how they fit into the world, I'd have to bring up their regeneration, its interactions with acid and fire, and all of that stuff. And you might argue that means that I am talking about the rules because those aspects are represented mechanically in how it operates as a monster. The counter, obviously, is that I'm not giving out hard numbers, just presenting broad information that anyone in the world would know. I wouldn't be saying Troll has regeneration 5, I would say trolls heal quickly unless the wound is hit by something that cauterizes it like fire or acid. My goal is to strike the best balance I can in presenting concrete information without just outright reading a stat block. Broadly speaking, I want my videos to be sorted into one of two categories: in-world information and out-world information. The most common ones are going to be the second type, out-world information. What I mean is I'll be presenting the information collected together the way you might see in a player or GM article. You'll have access to all the behind-the-scenes information that might be available about any specific topic, regardless of how easily a player might be able to get a hold of that information. With an in-world information video, you'll have an actual point-of-view character presenting information to a group, meaning there's more room for speculation, misinformation, or simply not knowing too much. To again provide an example, let's say there's a leader of a city that's secretly running a cult devoted to hunting down and murdering citizens. In an out-world information video, I'd tell you that piece of info right away. But in an in-world information video, that leader might be regarded as a hero and an upstanding character that people would aspire to follow instead. I wouldn't be providing that same sort of, but secretly they are a murderer kind of thing. Now you might be wondering why I would present in-world information videos at all, since they won't contain any new information that an out-world video wouldn't already touch upon. I have two reasons for this. The first is perspective. It can often be hard as a player to separate your own metatextual knowledge from what the character you're playing might know. I feel like providing a perspective of an in-universe character might help players that want to work on this, but struggle actually separating the information out. The second reason is much simpler. It sounds like a fun idea and I want to try it. Now the third reason for making this an issue 0, and that's setting some expectations regarding editions and timelines. This is a somewhat dense subject to get into, and it's going to require me to talk about the real-world history of the role-playing game and all that stuff. Pathfinder was originally created by Paizo following the switch from Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, specifically 3.5, to 4th edition. The system change caused an alteration to the open gaming license and ended the publishing contract for the Dungeons & Dragons magazine that were at the time published by Paizo. This basically caused them to decide to switch over to publishing their own game line because their 3.5 stuff was super popular and essentially just what was keeping the lights on. And with Wizards of the Coast no longer supporting it, Paizo decided, well, let's do it ourselves. The first few Pathfinder projects were actually published under the 3.5 rule set, and were compatible with that system, only switching to Pathfinder when the full Pathfinder role-playing game system released about 2 years later. A lot of stuff from Pathfinder carried on from what Paizo was doing in the Dungeons & Dragons magazine, such as their adventure paths. So the Pathfinder playtest began in 2008 for the first edition of Pathfinder, and in 2009 the Pathfinder core rulebook was released, and all subsequent products were published under the Pathfinder line. This lasted for an entire decade, up until the announcement of 2nd edition in 2018, 10 years after the original playtest had come out. In 2019, the 2nd edition core rulebook was released, which is the edition the game mostly used today. say. Anyone familiar with Pathfinder recently probably heard about the OGL scandal. In 2023, Dungeons & Dragons publisher Wizards of the Coast announced some drastic changes to its open gaming license, which Pathfinder 2nd Edition still used in order to make use of certain legacy parts of the property. Paizo did so because it allowed them to use certain otherwise copyrighted aspects of Dungeons & Dragons in their published works. Creatures, spell names, certain technical aspects of the system, and so forth required the OGL to continue using. This presented several problems. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't verify exactly how badly things might have been affected had this fully gone through, but Paizo does have lawyers, and it concerned them enough that the OGL was no longer viable. As a result, Paizo and a collection of several other TTRPG publishers came together to create the OpenRPG Creative License, also known as the ORC license. As a result of all this, Paizo began a project to remaster the core rules of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This was done to republish them under the new ORC license while removing anything that is no longer allowed to use due to the loss of OGL-specific material. In addition, having had a couple years of feedback on things like classes and certain aspects of the game, Paizo took the time to introduce a good bit of errata and updates to certain aspects. Functionally, this means that the Pathfinder world and system have undergone two dramatic changes related to the rules of the publication of the Pathfinder game. However, most of these changes are rules-related, not setting-related. When Paizo first announced 2nd Edition, one of their stated goals was that in-world characters would not notice any kind of change. Older players of Dungeons & Dragons, the game that Pathfinder drew its initial player base and DNA from, may remember that during its edition changes throughout history, they have been signaled by dramatic shakeups in the world that represent those mechanical changes. The most famous and notable being the Time of Troubles from Forgotten Realms, which oversaw the transition from the 1st edition of AD&D to 2nd edition. By contrast, Pathfinder 2nd edition didn't do anything like that, letting the edition change go through without mechanically explaining any of the changes that occurred. What did happen with the edition change was a sort of moving forward of the timeline, showing an updated version of the world, taking into account all the things that had happened in the last 10 years, as well as a few more revelations near the end that affected the system moving forward. Put a pin in that, because we're going to be talking about the timeline again in a little bit. With the remaster, things are unfortunately going to be a lot different. While certain aspects of the setting changing can be and are explained in world lore, due to the nature of this switch, there needed to be blatant retcons. Creatures that used to exist simply no longer do so, because the setting no longer has the right to use those creatures. Obviously, Paizo doesn't have the ability to go back in time and remove them from already published books, so some things are going to just be there that can no longer be referenced. This means that everything about them is going to be tricky to deal with. The biggest and most unfortunate example is definitely the Drow. While some creatures are general enough they can be tweaked and kept, at least according to Paizo's opinion, the Drow as presented were far too closely tied into the way D&D was using them. Without the OGL as a safeguard, it was determined that removing them was the best course of action. Unfortunately, the Drow are also really popular. They have been in basically any system they've been used in, and had a semi-consistent presence throughout Pathfinder's long history, including an entire adventure path in 1st edition that was dedicated to dealing with them. So what's my plan here? In the interest of presenting information as comprehensively as possible for any Outworld video, I am going to be including and discussing content as it was published, being as thorough as possible. Any video which contains something that was lost or changed due to the move from the OGL to the ORC will have a disclaimer on it stating that it uses old material that may not be 100% accurate. I'll also try and, again, be clear on what that is. Now, should Paizo put out any kind of official material going over a new canon sort, I will use it that way whenever possible. For example, if Paizo was to, for some reason, publish a new version of that adventure path that did not involve the Drow in any way, I would use that version instead of the original published version. If it's dramatically different enough, I may include a side video of information that was changed, but the main video will use the most up-to-date canonical information possible. I'm open to feedback, but for now it's the best I think I can do. So now let's circle back to that pin in that moving timeline. The Pathfinder setting has always advanced in real time, with 1 year passing in setting for every real-world year. What this means is that adventures generally take place in, or at the very least start during, the year they are published. This can actually be easily seen in the calendar used in the world of Galarian, whose last 2 digits always match up with the current year, which means the first published Pathfinder material for our year of 2007 took place in the in-world year of 4707. So what does this matter? Can't I just tell you the in-universe year and be done with it? Well, yeah, I can, but that's actually not the point. The point here is that Pathfinder had a lot of stories that occurred between the years we first got exposed to the lore, 4707, and the year where we got got that first major update for 2nd edition 4718, and I want to cover all that information. And because of that, I feel I need to draw a distinction between the lore of the setting as presented in its earliest forms and the lore as presented in the later books after time had really started progressing. Because of that, I'll also be releasing videos that have the initial version of the lore as presented in the earliest possible source without any major plot elements or stories having occurred there, while then also releasing later videos that show how the timeline had advanced. The goal I have is to provide information about the lore as it was originally established, where it currently is now, and what possible stories might have happened to make it that way. In this way, I feel like I can provide information for a wide variety of people. This might seem a little odd, but once it's in practice, it should be pretty clear and simple to understand. Which brings me on to the last topic, and if you thought I was long-winded before, get ready for this one. The last thing I want to talk about is what topics I'll be covering, when, and how I'll be covering them, and what to expect from them. So the short and useless answer is that I want to cover everything. If there's a Pathfinder product that has some aspect of story or lore to it, I want to cover it. And since I use the word story and lore a lot, I figure now is a good time to tell you what that means to me, since you're going to broadly define two kinds of videos. For lore here on the channel, that's going to cover essentially backstory and context information for whatever topic I'm talking about. The history of a country, the mythology surrounding a deity, legends on various kinds of monsters, background for historical figures that a researcher in present day might find, all those kind of things. The most important thing I want to emphasize here is that it won't cover anything that actively happened or is happening to the subject as part of an actual story. To use a separate media example, let's go to Lord of the Rings. If I was covering Lord of the Rings, a lore video about Gandalf would cover all of his history, actions, and adventures prior to the time of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. But it would not be covering his journey with Bilbo, his later journey with Frodo, the Balrog fight, his return as Gandalf the White, any of that. That information would be covered in a story video, which will talk about the character's actions and events that unfold as the timeline starts progressing. So, again, to go back to that Gandalf example, that would cover Lord of the Rings, Bilbo, Frodo, all that stuff. Pathfinder has a lot of stories being told all at once, all across the world, so there's going to be a lot that needs to be covered. However, I need to put a huge disclaimer on the aspect of this channel because it's going to arguably be the most subjective thing that I cover. Because I'm going to be covering adventures, and those are things that other people play in. Adventures, especially tabletop RPG ones, by their very nature are not set in stone narratives. It's possible for a party to negotiate with someone and avoid fighting them, get them to the party's side, or decide that they just want to go in the woods and go berry picking instead of deal with whatever the main plot is. A villain one group might slaughter with no thought can become another party's beloved redeemed NPC. So obviously I'm not going to be able to cover every possible variation that can occur in an adventure. That said, we're all well aware that pre-written adventures usually have an established plot, an ending that they're trying to go for, a beginning they want you to go through, set pieces you can go through. For first edition adventures, we also have information Paizo published in second edition for how things would have canonically turned out. So how are we going to cover it? Simply put, in order, as much as possible, with an emphasis on things that are more relevant earlier in the stories. To start off with, I'll be releasing videos about the various countries that make up the Inner Sea region, videos about the core ancestries and core deities, anything else that I feel would need to be basic primer information for anybody in this world. Once I feel we have some groundwork laid, it's time to start delving into the stories. To do that, I would be using, broad category that I'll be calling years. A year in this sense is actually going to be starting in the middle of the calendar. The first Pathfinder adventure path, Rise of the Rune Lords, had its first adventure published in August of 2007 and ran for 6 issues, which were released monthly, at which point the next adventure path started and it ran for another 6, taking us into August of 2008. At that time, the first season of the Pathfinder Society started publishing, which is the Pathfinder organized play events. Because of this, starting things out in August 2007 and having each subsequent year start in August makes the most sense. When we get later on the timeline, this may need to be adjusted, but that is going to be a long way away. I mean, if we're being technical, the first published adventures were modules published in July of 2007, but I'll be covering that as part of year 1 anyway, because tacking them onto the front just makes things line up more cleanly. Because these stories will be making up larger portions of what I'll be covering, aligning things there kind of makes sense to me. So we begin with the year 1 adventures, and we move through the timeline until we reach present day, making any adjustments needed along the way. So functionally, I will be covering all of year 1, then all of year 2, then all of year 3, as much as possible. Now, a few more notes before we wrap up. While I don't plan on giving a full walkthrough for each adventure I cover, I will be using maps for reference and going room by room to provide important bits of information as I see fit. For an example, let's say that there's a group of goblins that took over a large house and occupy every room. Most rooms would have random goblins just kind of doing whatever in them, nothing super important story-wise. However, let's say there's named NPCs in the kitchen, bathroom, and the master bedroom. Let's also say something really important that the characters need is in the sitting room of this house. Most rooms I could gloss over, simply saying they're filled with goblins engaging in various antics. But I might say something like, in the kitchen, the goblin beastmaster Tuss Talker is rummaging around for treats for his beloved boar pet, Piggy Daniel. Meanwhile, in the bathroom, the tribe's shaman, Rain a Whole Lot, is setting up a shrine into the shower, which she believes is a religious artifact. While much of the house is ransacked and damaged, the goblins have left the ancestral sword of the family laying in the sitting room after accidentally making it crackle with lightning while playing with it. Above them all, in the master bedroom, sits the leader, Comfort Claimer Cribbity. He spends his time in the master bedroom, luxuriating in the comfort of the many blankets and pillows he's found throughout the house. Now, while that doesn't tell you everything, it does give you a basic layout of the house, tell you about the important NPCs, provide hints about what's going on with them, like saying one is a pet, or that there's possible treasure in one room. As such, if you do plan on playing in any of these campaigns, I recommend avoiding any videos about that campaign just to be safe. Remember, these are your stories to tell as well as mine, and I don't want to bias your experience. I know a lot of people don't like spoilers, especially for campaigns, but there are a lot of these, a lot of adventures and campaigns, and it's incredibly difficult for a single person to play in every single one of them. Again, just keep in mind, if you do play in a campaign that I have covered in a video and you have watched that video, I would always advise telling your GM, hey, I kind of know a basic outline of what's going on. Do you want to worry about metagaming? Secondly, I'd also like to briefly mention Starfinder, and I do plan on eventually expanding the channel to cover the lore and stories in Starfinder as well. All the formatting would be the same, but it would be quite a while. I'm not going to wait till I've covered everything in Pathfinder to the year of Starfinder's release to cover Starfinder, but I do want to cover a large variety of topics that would be relevant to it, so it will be quite a ways away. Otherwise, it will work the same, with the exception of the Starfinder year possibly starting at a different point on the timeline because of when the Starfinder Society seasons and the Starfinder Adventure Paths refresh. So that is everything I wanted to copy on issue 0 of the series I am calling the Absalom Archives. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you all very soon as we cover topics that strike your fancy. Remember to explore, report, and cooperate, and may you ever walk that open road.